Hello, my name is Kunio Hara and I'm Associate Professor of Music History at the University of South Carolina School of Music. My area of research is the operas of Giacomo Puccini and the music of Japanese animation. Currently, I'm working on a project that aims to trace the history of performance and reception of Puccini's opera Madama Butterfly in the US and Japan. In this video, which I'm calling Lessons from Puccini's Madama Butterfly, I will share some of my observations I gleaned from the project about the challenges associated with cultural representation in today's digital world that I hope will be helpful to today's composers. There will be 4 sections in this presentation that starts with a brief summary of the opera and the issues surrounding the performance today, followed by historic consideration of Puccini's use of Japanese music in 2 parts. The presentation will conclude with a consideration of what we can glean from the example. So let's talk about Puccini's Madama Butterfly. As many of you are probably aware, Madama Butterfly is an opera that centers around the tragic romance between a young Japanese woman named Cho-san, also known as Madame Butterfly, and an American naval officer named Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton. The opera takes place in the city of Nagasaki in western Japan around the turn of the 20th century. The story of the opera is rather simple. Pinkerton is stationed in Nagasaki for a brief period and decides to marry Cho-san. Although he seems to love his wife, Pinkerton expects this to be a temporary arrangement and leaves shortly after the wedding. Butterfly, on the other hand, believes that this is an actual marriage and waits for the return of her husband with a son by him. 3 years later, Pinkerton returns to Nagasaki with another woman he had married back in the States. They intend to claim the child as their own. Shocked by this betrayal, Cho-san agrees to give up her son but decides to end her life. The opera closes with Butterfly's death by suicide while Pinkerton's voice is heard from the backstage calling out her name. The very first performance of the opera in 1904 was a failure, but Puccini made several revisions to the opera, and it has now become one of the most frequently performed opera today in the repertory around the world. However, in the United States, the opera has received some pushbacks recently because of its content. In crafting the libretto of the opera, Puccini and his team of librettists, Luigi Illica and Giuseppe Giacomo, adapted several source materials written by French and American authors. Although some of these authors had personal, direct, and indirect connection to Japan, the works contain many negative and inaccurate stereotypes about Japanese people and their culture. Although Madame Butterfly is clearly the heroine of the opera, Japanese characters in general are presented as somewhat alien and different from the American characters on stage in their demeanor and thinking. In the US, when the opera companies present these work on stage, they often tend to seize on this aspect, giving Japanese characters costumes, makeups, and gestures that are designed to stand out as being quaint or eccentric. At the same time, many musicians, designers, and audience members have genuine appreciation and interest in Japanese art and culture. This attitude also comes through, but often in conjunction with more outlandish versions of Japan. When I look at various historical documents, it is clear that many people of Asian descent have always felt uncomfortable about this aspect of the opera. Many cultural historians have argued convincingly that the story feeds into dangerous stereotypes that greet Asian women in the US, characterizing them as highly sexualized, disposable objects rather than a full-fledged human beings. But because they were often excluded from the positions of power to voice their opinions to instill changes, their feelings, the feelings of Asian audience, were ignored or not registered at all. However, the spread of digital technology and social media, which empower ordinary opera goers to express their thoughts instantaneously to a large group of people, have challenged the game to a certain extent. Opera companies became increasingly cognizant not only about these problematic issues in Madama Butterfly raised by grassroots organizations, but also inequities within the industry in the past 10 years or so. The wave of anti-Asian violence during the COVID-19 pandemic has made Madama Butterfly somewhat of a lightning rod for discussions about equity, inclusion, and justice in the opera industry. This turn of events have provided a platform for many Asian and Asian American cultural leaders, musicians, directors, and artists in exciting new productions of the opera. And here you see only 4 recent productions headed by Asian or Asian American directors in opera companies throughout the U.S. So far, the recent critical discussion about the representation of Madama Butterfly in the public tends to revolve around the visual aspects of the opera, costumes and makeups, gestures and movements, stage design, and lighting. But since I am addressing the group of composers, I would like to interrogate a bit about Puccini's engagement with Japanese music in the opera, which many scholars have agreed was quite extensive for the time when Puccini lived. I believe that looking back at this aspect of the opera, can teach us an important lesson for composers living and working today, particularly those who are interested in representing people and cultures unfamiliar to their own in a more inclusive and responsible manner. I also think that the lesson can be equally applicable to composers who aren't writing operas but are interested in expanding their styles through engagements with musical traditions and culture that are not familiar to them already. So let's start by turning to the music of Puccini's opera, Madama Butterfly, in particular his use of Japanese melodies. In composing the score of Madama Butterfly, Puccini was interested in giving a Japanese local color to his music. This was not necessary to make the music of the opera sound authentically Japanese, but rather to give the music a distinct sound that was evocative of Japan to the audience members in Europe as well as North America and South America. This desire for local color, or to make the setting of the opera reflect that its score, was something embraced by most composers of Puccini's time. The audience members also expected this and looked forward to something of this nature. But what is fascinating about the composition of Madama Butterfly is that Puccini reached out to a lot of different experts to gather information about Japanese music. Some of these were European scholars and collaborators. However, we also know that he met the wife of the Japanese ambassador to Italy, Hisako Oyama, who performed some music for Puccini and arranged some sheet music and recordings from Japan to be shipped to him. Puccini was also aware of the Japanese geisha turned actress Sadayako, who was touring Europe with her husband's theatrical company. He may have attended the performance involving her in Milan and witnessed firsthand Sadayako performing traditional Japanese songs and dances. Because of this, the score of Puccini's Madama Butterfly contained arrangements of several Japanese melodies that helped set the stage of the opera. Certain Japanese melodies are associated with Choja-san and used to sharpen the contrast between her and Pinkerton. That Puccini reached out to Japanese musicians and learned from their expertise is, I think, quite significant. Firstly, gathering information about Japanese music in Italy in the early 20th century was not an easy task. To be sure, there was a great amount of interest in Japanese culture, especially the visual arts in the late 19th century that created the artistic movement of Japanism. But the appreciation of performing arts was something else. Travels to and from Japan was extremely time-consuming, and recording technology had just been recently invented. Yet Puccini insisted on collecting as much as possible of Japanese music, and I think we can appreciate his effort in doing so. Secondly, most audience members that Puccini had in mind back in the early 20th century had very little knowledge or exposure to Japanese music. Because of this, Puccini could have invented music that sounded strange in one way or another, or relied on a set of existing tropes of exotic music associated with other parts of the world. It can be argued that Puccini did some of this to an extent. In fact, very recently, an American musicologist, Anthony Shepard, made the discovery that Puccini had used a tune found in the Swiss-made music box containing Chinese songs in one of Cho-Cho-san's aria. But this was more of an exception than the norm. Puccini's use of Japanese music contributes to the sense of local color. However, most audience members outside of Japan do not necessarily catch this aspect of the opera. But things are different in Japan. Very early audience members of Puccini's Madama Butterfly in Japan recognized Puccini's incorporation of music that were familiar to them. Combined with the Japanese setting of the opera, the use of Japanese tunes made the opera more approachable to the musicians and audience members in Japan. Others were skeptical of Puccini's understanding of Japanese culture because of the way he used Japanese tunes in the opera. Moralists were scandalized by Puccini's use of the tune Mia-san, which by that time had a vulgar connotation. Ardent nationalists were offended by his use of the Japanese national anthem, Kimigayo. 100 years after the creation of the opera, however, the cultural association with the tunes in Japan have shifted, and resistance to Puccini's use of Japanese songs faded. Many Japanese audience members today find the opera to reflect their own musical experience and take delight in hearing familiar songs arranged in Puccini's skillful orchestration. So now that we have gone over what Puccini did, let's talk about what he did not do. If you look at the poster and the title page of the libretto of Madama Butterfly, you will notice that they recognize two authors, John Luther Long and David Belasco. Belasco was a famous and successful, important writer and director of plays in Broadway. Puccini saw a production of Belasco's Madame Butterfly in London, and which was the direct inspiration for the opera. John Luther Long had written the short story Madame Butterfly that Belasco used as the basis of his play. It is very interesting that while the publisher took care to recognize the two authors of two source materials, there is no public acknowledgement of the musicians or music sources that Puccini consulted in writing the score. In fact, what I had presented to earlier about Puccini's encounters with Japanese music had to be pieced together by many musicologists from several different sources, including Puccini's letters, an analysis of Puccini's score with sheet music printed around the turn of the 20th century containing Japanese music. The fact that Puccini did not identify the origins of his music or musical inspiration was not unusual in his time. In fact, it would have been odd if he had done so. But looking back at the opera more than 100 years after its completion, it becomes clear that Puccini was operating under very different ethical codes than ours. If a composer were to base his work on an existing composition or worked with a collaborator, there is a cultural expectation today that the composer make proper acknowledgments and/or make arrangements for equitable profit sharing. Because of this, to us today, what Puccini did in Madama Butterfly seems extractive or even exploitative in that he sought out to access and make use of Japanese melodies for his own gains, without much, if any, consideration for the people who had originally created them. This fact bolsters accusation of cultural appropriation laid against Madame Butterfly today. But again, this kind of attitude was par for the course in Puccini's environment, and it is likely that something like this never crossed Puccini's mind when he was composing the opera. Yet thinking about this issue can help us, I believe, explore what we can do to make things more equitable. In this last segment of the presentation, I'd like to explore what Puccini's Madama Butterfly can teach us today about the pitfalls of cultural appropriation. Much of what I say may seem self-evident and not new, but I hope it gives you some issue or some food for thought along the way. First, in today's digital media saturated world, it has become exponentially easier to access music from around the world and from the past compared to what was available to Puccini. But this also means that we are also swimming in an ocean of information. In fact, paradoxically, this vast repository of information shows us that acquiring competency about different cultures and musical tradition is not an easy task that can be accomplished in a short amount of time. Because of this, it makes more sense for creative artists seeking to draw on musical traditions not familiar to their own to reach out for collaborators. We saw that Puccini also reached out to experts, but I think I would be hard pressed to call them Puccini's collaborators because he did not intend to work with them, but rather he was interested in drawing on their expertise. So cultivating a different kind of relationship with collaborators. Third, the example of Madama Butterfly teaches us that we have to be more mindful about the impact of representation. Now we are stepping away from Puccini's music and returning to the challenge inherent in the libretto. As discussed earlier, the way Cho-Cho-san is depicted in the story of Madama Butterfly has contributed to the reinforcement of dangerous stereotypes about Asian women. Although sexism and misogyny are not new and certainly existed in Puccini's time, the composer probably had no idea about how this aspect of the opera would play out in specifically American context 100 years after his death. These are hard issues without any clear solutions, but it seems like thinking more about the collaborative potential of creative process, allowing dialogues with other artists and those from the community who might be impacted may provide ways of overcoming this challenging issue. Finally, Puccini's Madama Butterfly points to the potential of giving back. This may sound somewhat ironic and contradictory. Earlier in the presentation, I said that Puccini probably did not have in his mind how his use of Japanese music might impact Japanese musicians he consulted. I still stand by this statement from the pieces of evidence we have. However, opera Madama Butterfly has been an important work for many Japanese musicians, directors, and even scholars like me that provided an early entry point into their respective industries. Historically, many singers of Asian background have used this opera to establish their careers. This was quite unintentional on Puccini's part, but something that musicians of Asian backgrounds have pioneered for a pragmatic reason, despite the problem inherent in this gesture. But in this manner, the opera Madama Butterfly, despite these negative drawbacks, have contributed to the careers of many individuals of Asian background. I have to wonder what powerful things can be achieved when the composer intentionally thinks about giving back when attempting to represent the people and culture outside of his of her own lived experiences. Thank you for listening to this presentation.